Everyone. Thank you for being here today for this webinar presented by Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman in partnership with the Behaviorally Informed Organizations Partnership. Although we are meeting virtually, we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We also stand in solidarity with the ongoing protests against systemic racism and discrimination. My name is Renante Rondina. I am a postdoc at BEAR, and I am the moderator for today's webinar. We're delighted today to have Simon Brascoupe, Anishinabeg Haudenausanee BEAR clan, who is a member of the Kitigan, Zibi, Anishinabeg First Nation, Maniwaki, Quebec. He is also the Senior Vice President of Education, Communications, and Services at the First Nations Education Administrators Association. Before I introduce Simon, I'd like to go over some ground rules for this webinar. Following this introduction, our speaker will deliver a 30 to 35-minute presentation. During the presentation, please submit questions to our speaker by clicking the Q&A tab at the top or bottom of your Zoom screen and type into the entry box. At the end of the talk, and with time permitting, we will have a question and answer session in which I will select questions from the Q&A tab to ask our speaker. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Simon Brecoupe. He is an adjunct research professor at Carleton University and an adjunct professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. He has a BA and MA from State University of New York at Buffalo and obtained his Certified Aboriginal Professional Administrator designation in 2014. Previously, Brascoupé was Chief Executive Officer of the National Aboriginal Health Organization, Director of the Primary Healthcare Division at the First Nations and Inuit Health Branch in Health Canada, and Director of the Aboriginal Affairs Branch at Environment Canada. He has written and worked in the field of traditional knowledge, financial literacy, and is on Trent University's Ph.D. Indigenous Knowledge Council. Simon is co-chair of the Indigenous Peoples Financial Literacy Working Group at the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada, and he has had experience with the development and delivery of Indigenous financial wellness programs and research of AFOA Canada. Thank you, Simon, for being here today, and take it away.
Okay, Kwei, thank you. So my name is Simon Brascoupe, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon and talking about one of my favorite topics, financial literacy, but also behavioral economics. I'm really into nudging, co-development, and working at the community level. So some of this presentation, or all of it, will be focused on these topics. So I'm going to put up the PowerPoint. So there's the PowerPoint. Trying to expand it. Okay, there we are. Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here. I'm also from the BEAR clan, and part of our responsibilities is education and medicine. So I'm going to talk about, I'm going to start talking about social determinants of health. And many of you may know that some of the social determinants of health is income. There's a link between income and health. The more education you have, the more money you make. The more money you make, the longer you live. There was a study done in London, England, and the wealthiest people live in the center of London. If you take a subway from the center to the outside of the town, the city, each stop, people live 1 year less. So it's a good indicator of how social determinants of health impact not only our longevity, but our health in general. So we're going to start there with that idea. And from an Indigenous perspective, health is much broader than in a Western perspective. So we take it into account spirit, emotions, body, mind. So you may be familiar with the Community Wellbeing Index. This just shows you where First Nations score is relative to other communities across Canada. So this was done from 1981 to 2016, I think, when they last reported this. So you can see that the score for Canadians is 77.5. First Nations is 58.4, and Inuit communities 61.3. So that index is made up of 4 factors: education, labor force activity, income, and housing. And I just want to focus on housing a little bit. I think during COVID, many of you may have read that Indigenous people are more at risk because the housing quality isn't as good as the rest of Canada. And also, there are many more people living in a household when you compare it to Canadians. So I could talk a little bit about stress. The stressor, I think, for Indigenous people has been the impact of colonization and residential schools. And so First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were taken away from their homes and put into these residential schools. And that's have had an impact on their, not only their health, but their mental health. So we have this idea called historical trauma. So the trauma from colonization and residential school has had an impact through the generations. There's quite a bit of research evidence base on this to support this idea. Loss of culture, language, land, another cause of stress. Poverty is a big cause of stress, which we'll be talking about. Low education attainment, and poor health, of course. So this is a table which looks at major depressive episodes in 2000 and 2001. So they compare low income to high income. So this is for Aboriginal off reserve where they have data. So the low income, you see that 21.4% of Aboriginal people off reserve in urban centers have greater depressive episodes than the average Canadian, which is 12.9%. So there's a gap of 8.5%, was pretty significant. And middle income, 13.2 compared to Canadians, 8.7, and that's a 4.5% gap. High income, you can see the gaps are kind of closing. High income, 7.7% for Aboriginal people, and then 6.3 for non-Aboriginal. So you can just see the impact if you're Aboriginal compared to non-Aboriginal. So the effects of debt stress, this was reported in a magazine in the US. So people have back and muscle tension, ulcers, heart, high blood pressure, depression, which we just talked about, migraines, anxiety, and insomnia. So these are all effects resulting from debt. So financial stress, the point I'm trying to make, has an impact on poor mental health and impaired decision making. There was a study done in India, and it was a fishing village, and the fishing village had, when they were fishing season, people were healthy, they made good uh, decisions, but when the season was off, they did a study on their IQ tests, and there was 11-point difference from when they were had income and they were healthy to when there was no income and people were unhealthy. There was another study done in the U.S. where they compared middle income people. So they took middle income people, had them do some puzzles, and then the next week they put them on a street diet, where a homeless diet, and so they weren't getting enough food. They were hungry, and when they went to perform the same tests, there was a significant difference from when they were eating properly to when they were eating poorly. So you can just imagine if you're living on the street or you're poor. I know that half the Indigenous population in Canada are food insecure. So you can imagine what the stress, but also not having enough food, has an impact on your life. So I did a study in 2013, and what I wanted to do was to show you some examples of the impact on financial literacy. So this is a Maori community. They were in a land claim, and they were also given or a bank account was opened when a child was born, and some money was put in it. And then the second, every year after that, more money was put into it, and it could be matched by, if the family put in $1,000, let's say, the land claim council would put in 3,000, and the children were also given financial literacy education. And what they found when they compared this particular community, compared them to other Maori communities, this community did as well on the financial literacy tests as other New Zealanders. So what that tells me is that you really have to do the combination of financial literacy education, and people have to have real money. It can't be play money, for example. So this was a report in The Economist, and what they found was they were looking at communities that had land claims, and in this particular case, it was casinos. So does the idea of giving everybody a per capita income, amount of money, produce results? And what they found was that tribes that give cash from casinos directly to members did poorly. They were, in fact, in poor economic situation than if they had not received any money. Is the tribes that don't give per capita, but what they do is they invest money in education, in business, in infrastructure in the community, do much better. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Indigenous healing or First Nations healing. So you may have heard this statement that elders talk about being on a healing path, or a First Nations person being on a healing path. What they mean is that they're healing from the impact of colonization, residential school, and it begins with talking. So this is actually one of the medicine society's approach to healing, the Medewiid Medicine Society. But it's an approach that's generally taken across Canada by Indigenous people. So in the top, we talk about talking. That part of healing is being able to talk about a problem or identifying the problem. For example, residential school wasn't talked about until the last 20 or 30 years. The next step is listening and learning. So we listen and learn from each other. If you have a problem with a friend or family member, this is the process that you go through. You talk about the problem, you listen and learn from each other, and then you are on a healing journey. And so First Nations are on individual, family, and community healing journeys. And that balance, just to bring up one of the concepts that I talked about earlier, was to find a balance between spiritual, physical, emotional, and mental aspects of us as a human being. So when we talk about holistic healing, we're talking about spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical. Those are aspects that Indigenous people and a lot of other people see as being holistic. I wanted to talk a little bit about healing and medicine. So what is medicine? So there's been studies in non-Indigenous communities that say that people, as an indicator, say somebody that lives over 100. A lot of communities that have people that live over 100, people are active. They're eating local food. They're eating local good food. They have friends and family. They have connection, spiritual connection to the land, to their area, and they have a purposeful life. So in the Indigenous world, we consider medicine, family is medicine, friends are our medicine, traditional foods are medicine. Food itself is medicine. We eat largely a diet that is poor, and it's not feeding our bodies properly. Land, connection to land is critical, and we don't have enough time to get into that, but land is really important to Indigenous people. When Indigenous people have been moved from their original homes, like in Grassy Narrow in Ontario, they were only moved like 8 miles, maybe 8 miles, and it was a disaster. They went from 90% deaths by natural causes in 10 years to 90% deaths by unnatural causes. So land is critical. Connection to our culture and to our language is critical, is medicine. And if you look at it from a decolonization approach, learning your language for the first time is part of that healing process, living a healthy lifestyle. So a lot of communities have this term called BEARxBIOrg, which is to live a good life. And having a healthy lifestyle is critical to that. Living that purposeful life and connection to community is also critical. So we're going to talk a little bit about financial wellness. So it's the balancing of income, savings, investing, spending to achieve a person's life goal from a physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual aspect over the life cycle from child, youth, adult to elder. And we also focus not only on the individual, but the family and community. I think that's one thing that is sometimes different with the First Nations or Indigenous communities, is that we look at it holistically, but we also look at problem solving from a family and a community perspective. So this is a Indigenous financial wellness framework that I worked with Prosper Canada in Toronto on. And we're looking at different aspects of financial wellness, which includes financial capability, which is financial education and counseling, which we'll talk about best practices later. Higher incomes, access to benefits, we'll talk about in a minute. Financial inclusion, affordable financial products and services, and financial security, savings and asset building. So we're going to talk about all these things. And one of the projects that I worked on with Prosper Canada and AFOA Canada, which is a Indigenous organization of financial officers. And one of the projects they do is First Nations financial wellness focused on tax clinics. So we start with education, providing those supports. Here we talk about one-on-one coaching to help people reach their financial goals. So a lot of the research focuses on this, and it's helpful for you that are thinking about, nudging. How do we get people to, or how do people become financially well? And it involves in not only just education, but nudging, incentives. Think back on the Maori project, and helping accessing income benefits, banking services, and opportunities to save. And that would be done through these clinics. So I'm just going to go through this briefly. There's a bit of a difference between on reserve and urban. So you're not paying income tax on reserve, but you are paying other types of tax. Urban, your income is taxed. You have more access to banks in the urban environment. And in most reserves, there's no local banks. I think maybe in Ontario, for example, there's about 7 on reserve. So to boost your income, there's barriers. People are unaware of benefits. People are worried about the CRA, its complexity. Low literacy, say people are speaking their First Nations language. Computer access is a problem. Getting your paperwork together to do your tax filing, and mistrust of the government. And we'll talk about that later. Lack of confidence, but mistrust of the government came out in a study that CRA did. This is building savings for retirement. 60% of Indigenous people are counting on government assistance alone for retirement. Expanding banking services. There are a few banks out of reserve. When we talk about Canada, it's very low. Access to benefits. So about 5 years ago, there was a report in the, I think it was in the Globe and Mail, that said that 50% of First Nations are not accessing the Canada Child Benefit. So on the back of a sheet of paper, I figured out it was about $500 million they weren't accessing. They're also not accessing, because they're not tax filing, other benefits. CRA did subsequent studies, and they were saying that, well, maybe it isn't 50%, it's more like 30 to 40%, but it's still significant. If I were to announce that I have $1 billion program, and all of this money will go into First Nations community this year, people would get excited. And it's just around the idea of the benefit of tax filing. So there's income boosting benefits that we talked about. There's quite a few programs that when people start tax filing, that they can access other benefits like old age security, guaranteed income. And some people, seniors, do not file for some of these because they hadn't worked, so they don't think they're eligible. So there's a lot of information that has to be directed to First Nations and Indigenous communities. Other things are disability tax credit, caregiver tax credit. And these just give you an example of some of the benefits. This was done in 2016. It's since changed. So I'm going to do a quick case study on tax filing. So the rest of it will be, this particular part of the presentation is from a study that CRA commissioned, the experience of Indigenous communities with tax filing. And so some people think that because they're tax exempt, they don't need to file. They have no income to declare, so they're not filing. But as we said earlier, there are lots of benefits that they're eligible for, even if they have no income. So the pros of tax filing is getting those refunds, benefit payments. What so they asked what the government could do. So they were asking First Nations, Inuit, Métis people in this study as they were doing interviews. So one of the big things is to build trust and confidence, be honest, work cooperatively, understand concerns, reduce the red tape. I should say that since this study was done, CRA has been working hard at reaching out to communities. But one of the most difficult things is that be honest. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis have a distrust of government based on history with the community. And developing trust and confidence in the community is objective number one. So this just lists all the difficulties, cost of filing, difficulty with getting answers on the phone, so lots of problems. It's made easy when financial situation is comparatively simple. Financial situation doesn't change from year to year. They have the required documentation. So being on social assistance entitles them to help completing and filing their returns. So a lot of First Nations have that support, but not for everybody. When it's difficult, they lack supporting documents, confusion, obtaining required documentation. So you may not have access to the internet. You got to write a letter, mail it in. So there's lots of frustrations. It's difficult. Continued disagreements with CRA. So what they found was in some communities where they've had local supports, the local support has expertise, and they're saying, oh no, that's not right. We're gonna write them a letter and we're gonna fix this. So the individual filers all have their own problems and difficulties that really need to be solved at the local level. So awareness of, how do we increase the awareness from low awareness? So we need education, tax literacy, awareness generated by word of mouth. So there's a little case study that I'm gonna look at later. And what they found was over the years, people started filing tax, and it probably a lot to do with word of mouth. So communities have challenges. Well, so we look at the community holistically, housing, infrastructure, substance abuse, employment, poverty, child and youth services are all challenges that community is addressing in the background to this tax filing. So sources of awareness of costs, benefits and credits is word of mouth when tax filing. But so word of mouth is the top source of information. Tax preparer, family and friends, radio, community services, through their work, through the CRA website. So you see the website is down at the bottom. Costs associated. So what they found in the studies is that if you were getting their tax return done in a local town, people had to take a taxi there. So the costs were between $150 and $200. So a First Nations community that's filing 100 members saves $15,000 that means that $15,000 is staying in the community. That's significant. So reasons for not tax filing: lack of need, costs associated with filing, and concerns about back taxes. So some of the barriers and challenges: lack of mailed tax forms. So often there's not a post office in the community. Connectivity, issues of back filing. There's a theme that's running through this presentation. So ways of reducing those barriers: in community training, information related to filing, outreach from CRA, in community assistance, tax clinics in the community. And successful approaches have been through public awareness campaigns, use of technology like social media, for example, integrate benefit screening into key services. So it could be health services, education. And this, just a little plug for the CRA's Community Volunteer Income Tax program. So this is the little case study I was going to talk about Wibicon. So they started in 2013. They did 143 filings. The next year, 357. The next year, 612. And the next year, 580. So it was on a exponential growth. The AFOA Canada is doing tax filing online. They used to do it in person, but because of COVID. So this is the information if you're interested in volunteering. This looks at financial wellness priorities as through the life cycle. So youth, opening a bank account is critical. Adult, managing household finances. Elder, planning for retirement and estate. And then got to go back to child, is the develop precursors to financial literacy, financial literacy or financial literacy, logic, reasoning. And this is, I got about 3 minutes to go through this. So this was taken from a document done by Prosper Canada, which I helped write on best practices. And these really focus on work on nudging. So work at the community level, engage the community level, co-develop the program at the community level. So some communities maybe want to do tax clinics. Some communities maybe want to do financial literacy to schools. So you start where they want to start on their path. Ensure programs are culturally relevant. That's critical. Ensure that it meets their cultural values and beliefs. Culturally relevant programs are critical. There's many different ways of engaging culturally and developing programs that are culturally appropriate. So sometimes you do training and you do an example of a person, a single parent or an elder. It should be done in the context of the community itself. Offer participants practical benefits. So one of them could be tax filing and doing financial literacy at the same time. Mobilize partnerships. So partnerships are really critical. So a lot of First Nations are partnering with organizations like AFOA Canada, Prosper Canada, the CPAs, local universities and schools. Take a strength-based approach. So don't look at the community as unable to resolve these problems, but as a community that has strengths that can be built on in developing solutions. You're all familiar with this, with the work that you're doing. And then these are some of the references that you can look at. The BC has a financial fitness guide. AFOA Canada, Aboriginal Financial Literacy Needs Assessment. It's excellent. The third one is literature review, which I did, and I used the Maori example from that. My Moola, which is an organization in the US, that's excellent. Prosper Canada, which I talked about. Atlantic Aboriginal Economic Development Integrated Research Program on financial literacy of Indigenous secondary students. And the British Columbia Association of Friendship Centers guide on Journey to Empowerment. So Miigwech, Yahweh, turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thanks for that. That was very interesting. We actually have a few questions from the audience already, so we're just going to jump straight to that. So first, Roger asks that you mentioned that something different is the focus on financial wellness of the family and community, and not just the individual. He was wondering if there are any cultural practices that reflect that.
So Indigenous people, well, I'll just tell you, when I first started working, I moved from the community here to Ottawa. And I would always say we, you know, and people well, were always confused. I say, why are you saying we? Because in some communities, if you say I, it's signaling that you're only concerned about yourself. When we talk about we, we're concerned about our family and our community. So the part of the cultural practices is that families are always engaged in all the things that we do. And a lot of times, say you go to a doctor, for example. I used to go with my aunt. My aunt goes to the hospital. The whole family may be there, you know. So it's a little difference, but it's a big difference in practice. Good question.
Sorry, I'm muted. Sorry about that. So the next question comes from our very own Dilip Soman. He asks, any thoughts on how to address the trust barrier? The skepticism is obviously warranted given history, but would appreciate any thoughts on how this can be overcome.
It's simple. We kind of jokingly, when somebody comes to their community, we're trying to figure out if they're a human being. And what they really mean by that is this somebody that's going to be talking to us like a friend, or is it a government bureaucrat? No disrespect to government bureaucrats or people that work in the government that are just going to go by the book, you know, by the rules. And so if you go by the book, by the rules, and you're not being yourself, personable, taking time to talk to people, having tea, you know, we say with my students, I say, if you want to develop a relationship, you know, have tea with people, visit people, spend time with them. And gradually over time, they get to know you. That's how you develop that trust. And that trust is easy to lose. So I know like the CRA people that I talk to really have been trying hard with their outreach to go to the communities, get to know people, develop that trusting relationship. I think it's a good practice anyways, and all the work, and I'm sure the behavioral economics courses that you're taking are reinforcing that you really do have to be, and I think with younger people, like my grandchildren have a different attitude than I did when they want real people, be real, you know, and I think it's still, you know, with public servant, I know the public servants, the younger ones that I know, not that the older ones aren't real, but they're taking a much different approach, which I think is positive. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Simon. And the next question comes from Sasha Tregbov at the BIT Canada. He says, Thank you for your talk, very insightful. The federal government recently announced an intent to implement automatic tax filing. I'm wondering if you think this might support First Nations and Inuit financial well-being and empowerment, and what needs to be done to realize that.
Well, I guess to go back to the presentation, or anything new, people need awareness, first of all. So what's the process that we go through? People develop awareness. You have to educate people. And how do you do the education? You have to really be there. You can't rely on, as from this presentation that I just did, you can't rely on government websites, because we know from the research that CRA did, they were like 10th or 11th on that list of where they're going to get it from their mother or the grandmother or the neighbor before they're going to get it from a government website. So awareness, education, how do we get that conviction, and that's the critical thing. That's the going into the community and demonstrating how simple this is. Nothing electronic is simple if you're not inclined to use the internet, and then, so that's how do we develop that conviction? We do it through face-to-face meetings. Somebody from CRA is in the community, I know they are. And then also to get that action from people really it's a lot of work to get there. I think that answers that question.
I think so too. Thank you, Simon, for that. Next question comes from Maria. She asks, do you have any examples of universities or colleges that are doing a particularly good job in partnering with Indigenous communities with issues related to financial planning for higher education?
The only one that I'm pretty sure that most universities have programs, I know was it Harvard University had a program on finance, personal finance, and almost every student took it. So I think the First Nations University in Saskatchewan, I know has a program, and they've been experimenting with it. So they have a financial literacy program for students. That's the only one I know of, but I never really looked at, I never really researched it, but it might be worth something for me to do in my spare time. But I know for sure that First Nations University has a program. Yeah, that's the only one I really know of. And I know that I was talking to one of the professors at one of the other universities, Ryerson, and they were trying to starting a program there. But that was before COVID, so I don't know if COVID kind of put it off for a year or so. So.
Yeah, thanks. That's that's a very interesting thing to think about. And yeah, COVID has had that unfortunate effect in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question comes from Yvonne. She says that you mentioned a distrust of governments, but is this sentiment carried across to other institutions like banks?
Absolutely. It's a distrust of institutions, and of course, if you remember, about a year and a half ago, maybe less, maybe a year ago, there was an elder, First Nations elder, went to a bank, and I believe it's in Vancouver, with his granddaughter to open up a bank account, and they both got ushered out of the bank and got handcuffed. And the police, as well as the bank employees, all had training in cultural safety training. But we know our institutions have systemic racism embedded in it. And I think that's one of the challenges that we're all going to be facing in our careers is how do we rid our institutions of these biases, of racism, not just for Indigenous people, but everybody. You Canadians, Canadians have been here for hundreds of years. And then I think the last year, we've seen more, like in the US and in Canada, that a lot of institutions are waking up to these biases. I think I may have gotten off track. Did I?
No, I think that was exactly spot on. Yvonne was interested in like this idea of mistrust in other institutions, and I think that was a very salient story. So thanks for sharing that with us. And yeah, it's definitely something we all need to keep thinking about as together. So we briefly touched upon this idea of like COVID affecting all parts of life, and particularly in your own work. Then, when it comes to both financial well-being and mental well-being, what do you think, or what are you worried about in terms of the effects of COVID, both like in the immediate term, like what's going on now, as well as like in the long term, what effects might COVID have in financial and mental well-being, like after the pandemic conditions have improved? Well,
one of the things I could have put up more data, but a lot of the research is saying that COVID has increased problems with mental health in our communities, not just Indigenous communities, but our communities in general. So in my work, mental health is one of the top priorities for us. How do we address the issues and problems around mental health? One of the areas that we have been focusing on is Indigenous culture and language. So that's part of the healing process for Indigenous people, is learning their language, practicing their traditions, ceremonies. So when we do a meeting like this, we often open with a prayer. So we do a smudge, and then we open with a prayer, and then we also close with a prayer. So I think that ceremony becomes part of our life. COVID has really restricted our ability to visit our families. I went and visited my mother, so I had to kind of lock down for a couple of weeks. I got a COVID test 3 days before I went, so I was absolutely sure, well, not absolutely sure, but very, very sure that I wasn't bringing COVID to my mother. And then when I came home, I had to do the same thing. Even though only person I visited was her. We had family members. I visited my siblings outside the home. Anyway, so COVID is having a major impact on how we do things. I think some communities are coping well by working online. A lot of communities are working less well because they don't have access to the internet, but they're adapting and they're adjusting, So I've been doing some research in that area. I think that financial help is a big factor for all our communities. That if you need more cleaners, you need, and it not only applies to schools, but all our workplaces, if people are still allowed to go to work, and then working from home becomes another issue that people have to adjust to. So I think maybe just to summarize that, what we're fighting with COVID is mental health is an issue. Getting outdoors is really good for Indigenous people, because outdoors is I spent a lot of time outdoors walking. So the outdoor activities, finding new ways to connect with each other, like sending cards. I've been sending, mailing more cards and letters, other than just doing it on Zoom or by phone.
Right. Okay, great. So maybe one more question here. So you spent a lot of time talking about the factors and barriers that affect Indigenous financial wellness. What are some of the most important ones that you think decision makers need that need to understand better when making Indigenous policy and programs related to financial literacy?
That's a good question. I think if I were to break it down to four things, we love, the old way was to develop a program, and often you developed programs in isolation, without doing your research on at the community level, or looking at best practices and lessons learned at the community level. So say you did all those things perfectly. You developed the perfect program, you got the perfect policy, and then you just shove it out there, So, in the presentation, I'm really talking about working closely with the community and developing that trust. So you've got to you've got to work with the community. I really think it's a 1 to 5 year effort. That going in 1 year and say, "Hi, my name is Simon. Here's the program. Isn't it wonderful?" And then go say goodbye, really doesn't develop that capacity at the local level. So what I did was, when I designed the because I had been working at AFOA in the past, when I designed the tax credit program, I found the best traders to develop the capacity of the, so we were able to send the First Nations volunteers for this best training in Canada. And it's like a 3-day training program. And they got to get trained every year because the program changes. And so developing that trust, having people with the right kind of training, going in and learning from your mistakes at the program level, in the delivery level, changing what doesn't work, finding out what works. So it's that iterative process that's critical. And then the other one is evaluation. We really do need to evaluate our programs, and I think when we develop programs, that they should be evaluated at the local level in terms and language that they understand. So it might be just doing interviews, for example. Does this work? Or observation during when you see the tax clinic being delivered. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for being here with us, Simon. I think we're just under the hour, so I think I'm going to close the webinar now. So again, we'd like to thank Simon for leading our webinar today. A full recording of this webinar will be available at our website by clicking the side tab labeled Events, and then clicking the sub tab labeled BEAR Webinar Series. Our next webinar will be on March 17th, and we will hear from Jiaying Zhao from the University of British Columbia. Thank you all for attending, and you can exit this webinar by closing your screen. Miigwech, thank you, and merci.
Yeah.